U.S. aims for Ukraine's ceasefire deal by April 20th, with Kyiv expected to recognize new borders. On March 23rd, Bloomberg News cited a source stating that the United States hopes to reach a broad ceasefire agreement in the Russia-Ukraine war within the next few weeks, aiming for a formal ceasefire deal by April 20th. According to U.S. Presidential Envoy Stephen Goodson, the most critical issue in the peace negotiations between Russia and Ukraine is the legal status of the territories, not only those currently controlled by Russian forces, but also areas still under Ukrainian control that were unilaterally annexed by Moscow in September 2022 and enshrined in Russia's constitution. These territories include Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia, all of which have portions still held by Ukrainian forces. Moscow demands that Kyiv and the international community recognize these regions as part of Russia, making it a precondition for any peace deal. Goodson also confirmed that Ukraine's potential NATO membership has been removed from the agenda. Instead, an alternative being considered involves providing Ukraine with security guarantees similar to NATO's Article 5, which states that an attack on one member is considered an attack on all. Goodson suggested these two key topics, new borders and security guarantees, could be interconnected and reciprocal. He noted that most of the annexed regions are Russian-speaking and had held referendums in which a majority voted to join the Russian Federation. This, he said, is the crux of the conflict and the first issue that must be resolved. He stated that the U.S. would be willing to provide security assurances to Ukraine, but in exchange, Kyiv would need to recognize Russia's status over certain territories and formalize new internationally recognized borders through a peace treaty. Only by doing so can the conflict in Ukraine be resolved and a sustainable peace be achieved, Goodson emphasized. However, the cost of achieving peace and gaining Western security guarantees would be steep for Ukraine, a country devastated by war, a near-collapsed economy, and the loss of approximately 30% of its territory, including the entirety of Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia.
Russia declares successful interception of large-scale Ukrainian UAV attack. On March 13th, a spokesperson for the Russian Ministry of Defense announced that the campaign to push Ukrainian forces out of the Kyiv region had entered its final stage. The Russian Ministry of Defense stated that its air defense systems had successfully intercepted and shot down 77 Ukrainian unmanned aerial vehicles, UAVs, during an attack that lasted from the evening of March 12th to the morning of March 13th. According to information from the Russian Ministry of Defense, these interceptions took place in multiple locations, with the highest concentration in the Bryansk region, 30 UAVs, and the Kaluga region, 25 UAVs. Additionally, Russian air defense forces also shot down 6 UAVs in Kursk, 6 UAVs in Voronezh, 5 UAVs in Rostov, and 5 UAVs in Belgorod. Ukraine faces difficulties on the Kyiv front line. As Ukraine's 8-month offensive in Kyiv gradually loses ground, experts say that despite some gains, Kyiv has also suffered serious losses. 8 months after launching a surprise attack on Russian territory, Ukraine's position in Kyiv is gradually becoming shaky. As of March 12th, the town of X, located just a few kilometers from the Ukrainian border, remained the last crucial stronghold in Ukraine's breakthrough zone. However, according to Roman Senko, Secretary of the Defense Committee of the Ukrainian Parliament, Russian troops had entered the town and were attempting to cut off Ukraine's supply lines. Senko stated that fighting was still ongoing, with Russian forces controlling part of the area across the river. However, he also clarified that no official reports had confirmed a full withdrawal of Ukrainian troops. Statements from Ukrainian officials suggest that at least part of their forces has begun retreating. Observers note that Ukraine's campaign in Kyiv has exposed several shortcomings. Initially, Kyiv hoped that the attack would force Russia to divert troops from Donbass to defend its territory, thereby easing pressure on Ukraine's eastern front. However, the reality did not unfold as expected, and Ukraine has lost additional territory in Donetsk over the past 8 months. Russia gains the upper hand on both fronts. The conflict in Kyiv demonstrates that Russia holds a significant advantage, with a 10-to-1 ratio in artillery, a 5-to-1 ratio in UAVs, and infantry forces comparable to Ukraine's. Meanwhile, in Donbass, Russia continues to maintain greater military strength and has expanded its territorial control in recent months. According to experts, Russia has chosen a war of attrition strategy in Kyiv, forcing Ukraine to divide its already limited resources between this front and Donbass. As a result, Moscow has been able to exploit this situation to gradually weaken Ukraine's military capabilities on both battlefronts. Although the Kyiv campaign allowed Ukraine to make a psychological impact by becoming the first army since World War II to strike Russian territory, the momentum was short-lived. Many Ukrainian soldiers have reportedly begun questioning the rationale behind maintaining a presence in Kyiv, while the Donbass front line remains highly contested. A lack of clear objectives and limited resources has hindered Ukraine's ability to hold on to its key positions. Analysts suggest that Ukraine's inability to retain control of Kyiv means losing a crucial bargaining chip in any future negotiations with Russia. Russia intensifies integration of occupied Ukrainian territories. As the world closely watches Russia's next move regarding the temporary ceasefire agreement with Ukraine proposed by the United States, questions remain about whether true peace can be achieved between the two nations. However, one undeniable fact is that even if the fighting temporarily subsides, the Ukrainian territories under Russian control are gradually being integrated into Moscow's administrative, passport, and education systems. Increased administrative control in occupied Ukrainian territories. According to France 24 on March 13th, Moscow's control over eastern Ukrainian territories has become increasingly systematic. Officials from Helping to Leave, an organization assisting Ukrainian citizens in evacuating occupied areas, reported that Russian checkpoints have become common at city entrances, rural regions, and major roadways. These checkpoints allow Russian forces to regulate access to different areas and scrutinize the identification documents of civilians. For those attempting to leave Russian-occupied territories for Ukrainian-controlled regions, the journey involves first passing through Russia and Belarus before reaching Ukraine's northwestern border. Border inspections at Russian checkpoints can take hours or even days. Russian border guards reportedly pay special attention to young Ukrainian men, most of whom have already been issued Russian passports and risk being conscripted into the Russian military. We can never guarantee that Russian border guards won't detain them. It's like a lottery, said Sofia, a representative from Helping to Leave. Last week, the Kremlin announced that it had issued 3.5 million Russian passports to Ukrainian citizens in the occupied regions of Luhansk, Donetsk, Kherson, and Zaporizhzhia, 4 territories Moscow declared annexed in September 2022. President Vladimir Putin confirmed that the passportization process in eastern Ukraine is largely complete, solidifying Russia's control over these areas. Forced integration and population resettlement. In occupied Ukrainian territories, those without Russian passports are classified as foreign nationals, stripping them of property ownership rights, pension benefits, and access to health care and social welfare. The Russian government has also been using humanitarian aid as a means to encourage people to accept Russian citizenship. This includes financial assistance for relocation to Russia, subsidies for families with newborns registered as Russian citizens, and other economic incentives. According to researcher Jaroslava Papieri from PB Ham University in the UK, children in Russian-occupied schools are required to follow the Russian education curriculum. The Ukrainian language, literature, and history have been completely replaced with Russian language, Russian literature, and Russian history. Any mention of Ukraine has been removed from textbooks introduced by Moscow, Papieri stated. While some parents continue to educate their children online following Ukraine's national curriculum, such actions must be done discreetly. Anything perceived as support for Ukraine has become dangerous. Even speaking Ukrainian in public could lead to arrest, Sofia warned. Strengthened Russian control and territorial consolidation. The Russian government has announced plans to build 25 new prisons and 6 detention centers in occupied Ukrainian territories by 2026. Additionally, Moscow is pushing forward with a resettlement program to bring Russian citizens into these regions. New legislation permits the confiscation of abandoned properties, while financial aid is provided to Russian citizens seeking to purchase homes in these territories. As of March 2024, at least 1,785 apartments and businesses in Donetsk and Zaporizhzhia have been seized. The tightening of control over all aspects of life in occupied territories indicates that Russia is gradually incorporating these areas into its administrative system. Analyst Papieri commented, although President Volodymyr Zelensky has repeatedly stated that Ukraine will never recognize any occupied territory as part of Russia. The longer these regions remain under Russian control, the harder it will be to reclaim them. Russia strengthens forces near Sumy. Ukraine warns of imminent attack. Russia prepares for a new offensive. Ukraine calls for allied action. Moscow is concentrating a large number of troops near the Sumy region, raising concerns about an imminent attack. On March 15th, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky stated, "We are fully aware of this and will take countermeasures." He emphasized that Western allies need to understand Russian President Vladimir Putin's strategy. What is he planning? What is he preparing for? And what is he deliberately ignoring? According to Zelensky, Russia's troop buildup indicates that Moscow is prolonging the conflict despite diplomatic efforts to achieve peace. The Ukrainian president also dismissed Russia's claim that a ceasefire is too complex, asserting, "In reality, everything can be controlled, and we have thoroughly discussed this with the United States." He accused Russia of intentionally stalling negotiations and stressed that immediately following talks in Riyadh, Moscow continued escalating its military operations. Military analysts suggest that Russia is attempting to push Ukrainian forces out of key defensive positions in western Russia, adding further pressure on Kyiv. In response, U.S. President Donald Trump has warned that thousands of Ukrainian troops are at risk of being completely encircled. Ukraine calls on allies to ensure security through military deployment. Also, on March 15th, President Zelensky urged Western allies to take a clear stance on ensuring Ukraine's security, including deploying military forces within the country. In a speech on social media, he stated, "These forces must be stationed directly in Ukraine. This is not only about ensuring Ukraine's security, but also the security of all of Europe." UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer also announced that the Coalition of the Willing, a group of Western nations, is developing plans to support Ukraine's security on land, sea, and air in the event of a peace agreement with Russia. Following an online meeting with about 25 Western leaders, Starmer emphasized, "We will strengthen Ukraine's defense capabilities and armed forces, while being ready to deploy troops if a peace agreement is reached to ensure comprehensive security." UK reaffirms cooperation with the US in Peace Assurance Plan. Additionally, Prime Minister Starmer stressed that any plans related to a ceasefire with Russia must involve cooperation with the United States. When asked whether he would continue seeking security support from Washington, Starmer reaffirmed, "The U.S. stance remains unchanged. I have made it clear that this must be carried out alongside the U.S. We are in constant communication with Washington every day." Ukraine sets conditions for lifting sanctions. Russia considers measures to ease economic pressure. Ukraine's conditions for lifting sanctions. As efforts to end the ongoing conflict continue, Ukraine has recently outlined conditions for the potential lifting of sanctions imposed on Russia by the West. According to Vlad Vus, Commissioner for Sanctions Policy under Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, the resumption of economic cooperation with Russia is only a matter of time, but it must occur under appropriate conditions. In an interview with Politico published on March 17th, Vus emphasized that economic restrictions, embargoes, and bans on Russian energy imports serve a specific purpose: to push Moscow to end its military operations and reach a long-term peace agreement rather than simply imposing punitive measures. He stated, "At present, it is too early to discuss lifting any sanctions. We only want to ensure that Russia takes significant steps in this direction before any discussions on easing sanctions take place." Vus did not rule out the possibility of European countries signing new agreements to purchase Russian oil and gas if and when the war in Ukraine ends. Russia has great potential, particularly in the energy sector, and it would be a mistake not to take advantage of it. However, we hope that Europe will never find itself entirely dependent on Russian energy in any form. Russia considers measures to ease sanctions. In a related development, Reuters reported on March 13th that the Kremlin is asking domestic companies to identify the sanctions that need to be lifted most urgently. This move comes as U.S. President Donald Trump has warned of stricter sanctions if Russia does not engage in negotiations, while also hinting at the possibility of easing restrictions if Moscow agrees to a ceasefire in Ukraine. A source in the Russian industrial sector told Reuters that the Ministry of Industry and Trade is distributing forms for businesses to fill out, asking them to specify which sanctions have had the greatest impact on their operations. According to the source, payment-related issues remain the most significant obstacle. Several businesses have reported rising transaction costs due to the need to use alternative currencies instead of the US dollar, making financial transactions more expensive and complicated. Additionally, 3 other sources highlighted energy-related sanctions, particularly restrictions on Russia's oil tanker fleet. When asked about the specific sanctions that Russia wants to be eased, the Kremlin stated that it considers all sanctions to be illegal and that they should be lifted entirely. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov told reporters, "These issues are part of ongoing negotiations, and I want to reiterate that there is no reason to rush into any conclusions." NATO suggests normalizing relations with Russia. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte recently suggested the possibility of normalizing relations with Moscow. In an interview with Bloomberg on March 13th, Rutte stated that it is natural for the conflict to de-escalate step by step for Europe and the US. And similarly, restoring normal relations with Russia should be approached cautiously and with a clear roadmap.
Russia pushes Ukrainian forces out of Kursk, increases pressure on northern front. According to El País of Spain, the commander of the Ukrainian Territorial Defense Brigade confirmed that Ukraine's military command in Sumy province has lost contact with its garrison in Kursk, Russia. The commander stated that communication between Sumy-based commanders and Ukrainian forces in Kursk has been disrupted. El País reported that between 6,000 and 10,000 Ukrainian soldiers are currently surrounded in Kursk, with the primary goal being their evacuation. However, the presence of Russian drones, UAVs, aerial bombardments, and artillery fire has made movement towards Kursk nearly impossible. Russia expels Ukrainian forces from Kursk, secures all settlements. The New York Times reported that Russian forces have expelled Ukrainian troops from most settlements in Kursk. Currently, Ukrainian forces are retreating from nearly all directions, holding only a narrow strip of land along the border, covering less than 30 square miles. Military analyst Piri Peronen from the Blackbird Group, think tank in Finland, assessed that the battle in Kursk is reaching its final stage. Ukrainian soldiers stated that their objective is no longer to hold captured areas within Russian territory, but to secure strategic defensive positions to prevent Russian forces from advancing into Sumy and opening a new front. The Wall Street Journal noted that while Ukraine's withdrawal appears organized, signs of chaos persist. For some units, the retreat under heavy Russian fire has come too late. Recent images from Russian news agencies depict Russian forces capturing at least one M1 Abrams tank and several US-supplied armored vehicles, with the remains of Ukrainian soldiers inside. Donetsk and Luhansk fronts see continued developments. On March 16th, Reuters cited Russian officials stating that Russian forces were expelling the last Ukrainian soldiers from Kursk, while simultaneously clearing large quantities of landmines in the region. Notably, not only has the Kursk front witnessed significant developments, but Russian forces have also made further gains in Donetsk. On March 16th, Russian state broadcaster 1TV announced that Russian forces had taken control of 4 settlements in Donetsk over the past week: Dzerzhinsk, Konstantinovka, Novomarkovo, and Koki. According to Lenta, Russian forces have also seized the settlement of Novy Lyubov in Luhansk and continued expanding their control in Kharkiv. These recent advances bring the total number of settlements captured by Russia since the start of its military campaign to 70. Potential Russian advance toward Kyiv after over 2 years of conflict. According to Lenta, Ukrainian forces are withdrawing from multiple directions. Speaking to the publication on March 17th, British military analyst Alexander Mercouris suggested that Russian operations in northern Ukraine could bring Russian troops closer to Kyiv, and he did not rule out the possibility of Moscow continuing its offensive in this region. Mercouris stated, "Current developments may bring Russian forces closer to Kyiv from a significantly stronger position compared to February and March 2022. Russian state news agency TASS reiterated earlier remarks by President Vladimir Putin in which he asserted that Russian forces had made advances across most battlefronts and were now in a favorable position to encircle large Ukrainian military formations. Hungary unexpectedly supports extension of sanctions against Russia following U.S. pressure. Recently, Hungary, a country that had previously opposed the European Union's EU extension of sanctions against Russia, has shifted its stance after direct intervention from the United States. According to sources, a phone call between U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio and Hungarian Foreign Minister Péter Szijjártó played a crucial role in this decision. During the discussion, Secretary Rubio persuaded his Hungarian counterpart to abandon plans to block the sanctions package, thereby allowing the EU to maintain unity in its pressure campaign against Moscow. Earlier in January, Budapest had threatened to veto the renewal of these restrictive measures, citing Donald Trump's election as U.S. president and the anticipated changes in Washington's foreign policy. The Hungarian government has repeatedly emphasized that sanctions have harmed the country's energy security, particularly given its heavy reliance on Russian supplies. However, after negotiations with Secretary Rubio, Szijjártó agreed to support extending the sanctions for another 6 months, an unexpected shift for a nation that traditionally holds a distinct stance within the EU on Russia-related matters. Hungary's decision paved the way for the EU to formally approve the next phase of its sanctions regime on June 17, 2025. These measures have been in place since 2014 and are regularly updated to respond to Russian actions. Compromise between EU and Hungary achieved after energy supply assurances. According to Bloomberg, the compromise was reached after Budapest received assurances regarding energy supplies, though the specific details of the agreement remain undisclosed. The negotiations with Hungary reflect a broader context of U.S.-European interactions amid shifting strategies in Washington. As reported by Reuters, since President Trump's return to the White House, Washington has actively worked to coordinate its policies with allies. Earlier this month, the U.S. sent a delegation to Brussels to discuss sanctions, emphasizing the need for a unified response against Russia. At the same time, President Trump also announced plans to reassess his approach to the conflict in Ukraine, raising concerns in Europe about the possibility of a softer stance from Washington toward Moscow.